Homeless
How
at
much for
18
this
with nothing
fine
to her
tea?
name but a
Do I hear
carpet bag for
100?
$1.60
now, who'll
and a
make it
coat
20?
too thin for the
Going
wind coming
once,
down off the
going
Laramie
twice.
Range, Clara Jane Merritt stood at the edge of an auction crowd in Larkspur Crossing, Wyoming Territory, and did the one reckless thing left to a girl with nothing left to lose. Her step-uncle, Elias Bragg, had put her out of her father's house not 6 weeks after the funeral, telling the county clerk that the Merritt land was his by unpaid debt and telling Clara, more plainly, that he had no obligation to feed another man's daughter. She had walked and ridden and walked again until she reached this dusty crossroads town, and there, on a cold March morning in 1886, she spent nearly every cent she had left, $100 saved coin by coin from a summer of laundering other women's linens, on a sway-backed, forgotten ruin of a building the auctioneer could barely be bothered to describe, the old Halloway Stagecoach stop, boarded shut for 14 years, sitting alone on the prairie like a tooth pulled from the town's memory. Everyone who watched her raise her hand called it a fool's purchase. They did not know, and neither did she, not yet, that sealed inside those silent walls was a secret that had been waiting patiently for someone honest enough to find it. A secret that would not only change the course of Clara's life, but would settle a debt the whole town of Larkspur Crossing had been carrying unknowingly for 14 long years. Settle in and let us tell you the story of Clara Jane Merritt. If you're watching this from a place that feels forgotten, overlooked, or written off by everyone around you, tell us where you're watching from in the comments. We'd love to know we're not so far apart after all. Clara had not always been a girl with nothing. She had been raised on a modest wheat farm 11 miles outside of Cheyenne, the only child of Thomas and Ruth Merritt, and though the Merritts were never wealthy, they were, in the particular currency of the frontier, rich in the things that mattered. Her father had been a quiet, careful man, the kind who mended his own harness leather and could set a broken bone as competently as any doctor within 40 miles, because he believed a person ought to know how to fix what was broken rather than simply mourn it. Her mother, who died of a fever when Clara was 11, had been a seamstress before her marriage, and in the years she had left to give, she had passed to her daughter not just the practical skill of a needle and thread, but something harder to name, a way of looking at worn, discarded, unwanted things and seeing, underneath the dust and the damage, what they had once been and what they might be again. Ruth Merritt used to say that nothing was truly ruined, only unattended, and she taught Clara to turn flour sacks into pillowcases, to unpick and reknit sweaters gone through at the elbow, to see a cracked plate not as trash but as a puzzle waiting for glue and patience. It was a philosophy, not just a skill, and it settled into Clara's bones so deeply that by the time she was 16, she had a small reputation around Cheyenne for taking in mending and darning that other women had given up on, work too fine or too far gone for less patient hands. Her father, for his part, taught her the land, how to read weather in the color of the sky at dusk, how to judge the health of a horse by the set of its ears, how to find water where the grass grew a shade greener than it ought. He taught her, too, a quieter lesson, one he repeated so often it became a kind of family scripture, that a person's worth was not measured by what they owned, but by what they were willing to build, mend, and give back to the people around them. Thomas Merritt had come west with almost nothing himself in 1861, a boy of 19 with a mule and a rifle and a debt of gratitude to a stranger who had once shared his fire and his flour on a hard winter crossing. He never forgot that kindness, and he spent the rest of his life trying to be, in his turn, the stranger at someone else's fire. He fed drifters. He forgave debts owed to him by poorer neighbors. He rebuilt, with his own hands and without asking a cent in return, the barn of a widow 2 farms over after a windstorm tore it apart. Clara grew up watching this, absorbing it the way a child absorbs a language, until generosity and resourcefulness were not virtues she practiced but simply the shape of who she was. When her father died, thrown from a spooked horse in the autumn of 1885, a death as sudden and senseless as such things always are, Clara believed in her grief that she still had a home. She did not know, because her father in his quiet way had never burdened her with worry, that in a lean year some seasons back he had borrowed against the farm from his half-brother Elias Bragg, a hard, calculating man who had drifted in and out of Thomas's life for years, always with an eye toward what might one day be owed to him. Elias produced the note within a month of the funeral, called the debt due in full, and when Clara could not pay it, could not because she had never even known of its existence, he took the farm under the letter of the law and put her out with a coldness that still, months later, made her hands shake to think of. He did not raise his voice. He simply told her, standing in the kitchen where her mother had once taught her to darn socks by lamplight, that she was 18 now, grown, and no longer his responsibility, if indeed she ever had been. He gave her 2 days to gather what she could carry. She took her mother's sewing basket, her father's pocket knife, a wool coat, and the small tin box of coins she had saved from years of mending work, and she walked away from the only home she had ever known without looking back, because she had learned from her father that looking back rarely mended anything. She drifted for a time, taking in wash and mending in Cheyenne, then in smaller towns along the rail line, always moving because a girl alone with no family name to shelter behind found that towns had a way of closing gently around her the way a hand closes around something it does not quite trust. By the time she reached Larkspur Crossing, a modest crossroads town of perhaps 400 souls, built up around a dry goods store, a small Methodist chapel, and the bones of what had once been a busier stage route before the railroad passed it by, Clara had $4.60 to her name and a growing, gnawing fear that she was running out of towns before she ran out of winter. It was in Larkspur Crossing, on a raw March morning with frost still silvering the wagon ruts, that she wandered into a small crowd gathered outside the county land office and learned that the town was, that very day, auctioning off a handful of abandoned properties for unpaid taxes. Properties nobody wanted, structures the town would rather see gone than continue paying to survey and record. Chief among them, and the last to be called, was the old Halloway Stagecoach stop, a low log and stone building some 3 miles outside town on the old Cheyenne, Fort Laramie route, shuttered since 1872 when the stage line rerouted north and left it to the weather. The auctioneer, a portly man named Gideon Voss who ran the land office and clearly wanted the whole business finished before dinner, described it with visible boredom. One stagecoach stop, structurally sound enough, some outbuildings, no known claim, going for back taxes owed. And the crowd, mostly men there for better prospects, murmured with faint amusement. Someone in the back called out that the place was cursed, that old Tom Halloway had died alone in there of a fever and been found 3 weeks later by a passing drover, and that nothing good had come from that building since. Someone else laughed and said the only thing haunting Halloway Station was rats. Clara, listening from the edge of the crowd with her tin box of coins clutched inside her coat pocket, felt something she could not entirely explain. Not romance, not superstition, but a kind of recognition, the same instinct her mother had trained into her at a sewing table years before. Here was a thing everyone had decided was ruined, and ruined things, in Clara's experience, were very often only unattended. When the bidding opened at $100 and nobody else raised a hand, Clara raised hers before she had entirely decided to do it, and the words left her mouth with more steadiness than she felt. "I'll take it, sir." $100. The crowd turned to look at her, a thin girl in a patched coat, alone, clearly not a woman of means, and Gideon Voss himself paused with his gavel half raised as if waiting for someone to explain the joke. But no one bid against her because no one else wanted the place badly enough to spend good money on it, and so, with a knock of the gavel and a look of mild pity from the auctioneer, Clara Jane Merritt became, for the whole of the fortune she had left in the world, the owner of a dead stagecoach stop that the town of Larkspur Crossing had long since stopped thinking about at all. She walked the 3 miles out to it that same afternoon, because she had nowhere else pressing to be and because she wanted, urgently, to see what she had bought before the daylight failed her. The station sat low against a rise of cottonwoods along a dry creek bed, its log walls silvered gray, its shake roof sagging, but, she was relieved to see, largely intact. The door had been nailed shut with 2 crossed boards, weathered nearly to the color of the logs themselves, and it took her the better part of an hour with her father's pocket knife and a length of fence wire to work them loose. Inside, the air was thick with the particular stillness of a place too long undisturbed, dust motes turning slow in the shafts of late light, a smell of old wood smoke and mice, and underneath it, something drier and older that she could not name. There was a stone hearth along the back wall, a long trestle table gone gray with dust, a rope bed frame in the corner room that had once served as the station keeper's quarters, and shelves still holding a few cracked crockery jugs. It was, in short, exactly what it appeared to be, the abandoned home of a man 14 years dead, left more or less as he had left it, because no one had cared enough to clear it out. It was on her second evening there, after she had swept the worst of the dust and rigged a bed of sorts near the hearth, that Clara made her first discovery, and it came, as such things often do, from her mother's old habit of looking closely at things other people overlooked. She had built a small fire against the evening chill and was examining the hearthstones for draught when she noticed that one flat stone, set low in the hearth's side wall, sat very slightly proud of its neighbors, its mortar a shade paler and less weathered than the stone around it, the kind of small inconsistency that would mean nothing to a person in a hurry, but which snagged at Clara the way an uneven stitch snags at a seamstress's eye. She worked at it with the tip of her father's knife until the stone shifted, and behind it, wrapped in a scrap of oiled canvas gone stiff with age, she found a small tin dispatch box, the kind stage lines used for carrying mail and station accounts, its lid rusted nearly shut. Her hands were unsteady as she pried it open by the dying firelight, and inside she found not gold, not treasure, but something that would prove in the end to matter a great deal more, a stack of papers brittle and foxed with age, a station keeper's ledger, several letters addressed to a Thomas Halloway, and tucked beneath them, a single folded document sealed with wax that had never been broken. Clara spent that first night reading by firelight, piecing together letter by letter, the story of the man who had lived and died in the room where she now sat. Thomas Halloway, she learned from the ledger's careful, cramped hand, had run the Stagecoach stop for nearly 20 years, and had been, by every account the papers offered, a scrupulously honest man. Every dollar of wayfare, every ounce of grain sold to passing travelers, entered and balanced to the penny. But it was the letters that deepened the mystery, for they were not addressed to Halloway from strangers, but from a Reverend Amos Whitcomb of the Larkspur Crossing Methodist Chapel, and they spoke with increasing urgency across several months in the winter of 1871 and 1872, of a relief fund. Money raised across the town after a fire had gutted half the main street the previous autumn, destroying the dry goods store, the smithy, and several homes. The letters made clear that the fund, some considerable, some collected from every family in town, farmers and merchants alike, had been placed in Halloway's keeping rather than the bank's at the town's own request, because the bank examiner was due through on his rounds and the town's newly appointed treasurer, a man the letters named only as Mr. P., had urged that the money be kept apart from bank ledgers until certain irregularities in his own accounts could be quietly resolved. Halloway, trusted by everyone as an honest man standing outside the town's internal politics, had agreed to hold it at his station until spring. Then came the blizzard of February 1872, one the ledger described in Halloway's own hand as the worst he had seen in his years on the line. 3 days of white wind so total that even the mail rider dared not travel. Halloway had sheltered, the ledger recorded, a stranded party of 6 travelers through the worst of it, feeding them from his own stores, nursing one elderly passenger through a fever that Halloway himself, the entries suggested, caught in turn. The ledger's final entries grew shakier by the day, the hand less steady, until they stopped altogether in early March, the last line simply reading, "Fund secure. Will deliver to Reverend W., upon first thaw, God willing." God evidently had not been willing. Halloway died alone in his station sometime in the following weeks, and by the time a drover found him, 3 weeks gone, the money was nowhere to be found by the few who came to search the place, and in the absence of any better explanation, and perhaps Clara began to suspect, with some quiet encouragement from the very Mr. P., whose accounts had needed shielding in the first place, the story that took root in Larkspur Crossing was that Thomas Halloway had stolen the relief fund and died. With his secret, a dishonest man unmasked too late for justice. His name, so far as Clara could tell from the yellowed newspaper clipping tucked among the letters, had been dragged through the town's memory ever since. The Halloway theft spoken of apparently as settled fact for 14 years, the very reason she now understood, that no one in town had wanted this station, this land, this legacy at any price at all. The sealed document beneath the letters, when Clara finally worked up the courage to break its wax 3 nights later, proved to be Halloway's own handwritten account, composed by its shaking script in the last days of his fever, addressed to no one and everyone. A full confession not of theft but of stewardship, describing exactly where the relief fund lay hidden, not in the tin box which held only his private papers, but beneath the false floor of the tack room, sealed in a strong box. Behind a false wall he had built himself, safe from thieves and safe, God willing, until an honest hand finds it and sees it home to the people it belongs to. He had meant, the document made achingly clear, to recover and deliver the fund himself the moment he was well enough to travel, and had trusted that his ledgers and his lifetime of honest dealing would speak for him if illness took that chance away. It had not been enough. No one had looked for a ledger. No one had looked for the truth at all. They had simply looked for someone to blame, and a dead man made an easy, undemanding villain. Clara sat with that discovery for a long while. The fire burned low, understanding with a clarity that felt almost physical that she was holding in her 2 hands, both a fortune and a wrong that had gone uncorrected for 14 years. She thought of her father's kitchen table, of Elias Bragg's cold voice telling her she was no longer his responsibility, and she thought too of the strangers her father had fed at his own fire because a stranger had once fed him. She did not, even in that first startled hour, consider the money hers to keep. It had never been Halloway's and it was certainly not hers. It belonged, plainly and entirely, to the families of Larkspur Crossing who had given it up in grief and fear after their own street had burned, and to the memory of a man who had died trying to protect it. But she understood too, with a colder, more practical part of her mind, that a girl of 18 with no family name, walking into town claiming to have found a fortune buried by a man everyone believed a thief, would very likely be laughed out of the county, or worse, robbed of the discovery entirely by someone with more standing than she had. She would need to move carefully. She would need proof. And she suspected, though she did not yet know his name, that whoever Mr. P. had been in 1872, his family's comfort in Larkspur Crossing might still depend, in ways not yet visible to her, on Thomas Halloway remaining exactly as guilty as everyone believed him to be. She found out his name within the week, when she went into town for supplies and mentioned, carefully and without detail, that she had bought the old Halloway station and meant to fix it up. The dry goods clerk went quiet, and a heavy-set man drinking coffee near the stove, introduced to her with some deference as Mayor Corwin Pruitt, set down his cup with a sharpness that seemed disproportionate to the news. He was, she learned, the son of the very treasurer named obliquely in Halloway's letters, a man who had died some years back but whose son had inherited both his father's seat of influence in Larkspur Crossing and, it seemed, an inherited discomfort with any renewed talk of Halloway Station at all. Pruitt was polite to her face in the stiff, overwarm way of a man who wants something to simply go away, telling her the place wasn't fit for a young woman alone, that the land was poor, that she'd be better served selling it back to the town for a fair price and moving on to somewhere more suitable. Clara thanked him and said she intended to stay, and watched something tighten behind his eyes before he excused himself. Over the following weeks, the opposition grew less polite. Clara found her water barrel overturned twice, found the fence around the small garden she had begun to till torn down in the night, and heard, secondhand from a sympathetic farm wife named Odalie Renner who brought her eggs and gossip in equal measure, that Mayor Pruitt had been telling folks in town that the girl at Halloway's was not quite right, touched by grief, digging in the dirt out there for reasons nobody sane could explain. A story calculated, Clara understood, to isolate her. Before she could be believed about anything at all. She began to suspect, watching a man she did not recognize ride slow circles around her land at dusk one evening, that Pruitt was not merely embarrassed by old rumors but actively searching, or having searched, for something he feared she might find before he did, which told her, more clearly than any letter could, that some part of him had always known his father's accusation against Halloway was a lie built to cover a debt his own family could not otherwise explain. Clara did not confront him. She had learned patience from a needle and thread long before she had learned it from hardship, and she understood that the only proof that would matter in Larkspur Crossing was proof that could not be argued away. Working at night by lamplight, careful to disturb nothing that might be seen from the road, she pried up the boards of the tack room floor exactly where Halloway's confession had described, and found, behind a false wall of stacked stone so cleverly built it might have stood undiscovered another 14 years, a heavy iron strongbox, its lock long rusted, its contents, when she finally forced it open with a fence bar and her own trembling determination, a sum of gold and silver coin far greater than she had imagined, wrapped still in the oilcloth bundles in which frightened, grieving families had entrusted it to a man they trusted more than their own bank, alongside a second, smaller ledger in Halloway's hand listing, family by family, exactly what each household of Larkspur Crossing had contributed to the relief fund in the terrible winter after the fire. It was that second ledger, more than the coin itself, that gave Clara her plan, because it meant she did not have to ask anyone to simply believe her. She could show them, name by name, precisely what was owed to precisely whom. She rode into town the following morning not to Mayor Pruitt's office, but to the Methodist chapel, where the current minister, a young, earnest man named Reverend Silas Coe who had inherited old Amos Whitcomb's pulpit but none of his history, listened to her account with a stillness that told her he understood at once the weight of what she carried. Together, in the presence of Gideon Voss from the land office and two of the town's oldest and most respected farmers, men Clara chose deliberately for their long memory and their standing beyond Pruitt's easy influence, she laid out the ledger, the letters, Halloway's sealed confession, and the strongbox itself, family name by family name, dollar by dollar, until the room fell into the particular silence of people watching an old, comfortable story collapse under the weight of a true one. Mayor Pruitt, summoned to answer for his father's letters and his own campaign against Clara once the town's mood had visibly shifted, did not confess outright, men rarely do, but his composure cracked in small, telling ways. A stammer over dates, a refusal to meet the eyes of the two old farmers who had known his father well enough to recognize at last, the shape of an old cowardice dressed up as scandal. He did not go to prison, for embezzling one's own community's trust through silence and suggestion was not, strictly, a crime the county courts recognized, but the justice that found him was, in its way, more lasting. Within a season, Larkspur Crossing quietly declined to return him to the mayor's seat, and the story that had shadowed Thomas Halloway for 14 years unraveled entirely, replaced at last by the truth that he had been exactly the honest man his ledgers had always shown him to B. A man who died trying to keep a promise rather than break one. Clara could have kept a share of the fortune for herself, and no one in town, once the truth was known, would have begrudged her a portion of it. She had, after all, spent nearly everything she owned on the land, endured months of hardship and hostility to see the truth uncovered, and had every legal claim to whatever was found on property that was hers by purchase. But she thought again of her father's fire, and of the strangers he had fed at it, and she understood that the money had never once in all its history belonged to anyone's private ambition. It had been the town's grief and the town's hope, pooled together after a fire had taken half its street, and it belonged, still, to that same purpose. She proposed, at a town meeting held that spring in the newly reopened Holloway station, for she had, by then, resolved to keep the place standing rather than sell it, restoring it herself plank by plank as a kind of quiet monument, that the recovered fund be used exactly as it had first been intended, to rebuild what the fire and the years of neglect had cost Larkspur Crossing, a proper schoolhouse where the burned one had never been replaced, a rebuilt smithy and a small endowed relief account held now openly at the bank under the town's collective oversight, so that no family would ever again face hardship without a safety net the whole community had chosen to share. The town, moved and more than a little humbled, agreed without argument, and something in Larkspur Crossing seemed to loosen and breathe again that had been held tight and mistrustful since the winter of 1872, as though the whole town, not merely Thomas Halloway's memory, had needed clearing of an old, unspoken guilt it had carried without quite knowing why. And so it was that Clara Jane Merritt, 18 and homeless, cast out by an uncle who valued a debt more than his own blood, arrived in Larkspur Crossing with $4.60 and left her mark on it as the woman who had bought a dead man's ruined station for $100 and in doing so, had returned to an entire town what it believed it had lost forever, not merely a fortune in gold and silver, but its faith in a good man's memory, and in the plain, unglamorous truth her own parents had taught her, that nothing discarded is ever truly worthless, only waiting patiently for someone honest enough to look closely, and generous enough to give back more than they were ever given. She did not do it for wealth, though she never wanted for it again. She did it because a needle and thread and a father's fire had taught her long before she ever saw Holloway Station that the truest inheritance a person could receive was not land or money at all, but the simple, stubborn habit of mending what others had given up on. We hope Clara's story stayed with you the way it stayed with us in the telling. A reminder that value has a way of hiding in the very places the world has decided to stop looking, and that an honest hand, however young or however poor, can still set right what years of silence left broken. If this story moved you, we'd be grateful if you'd share it with someone who might need the reminder today, and we'd love to hear your answer to this in the comments. What is a time you found real worth in something, or someone, that everyone else had already written off? Thank you for spending this quiet hour with us. Until next time, stay close.